Okay. Well, it's unfortunate I don't have I only have one sea captain who died drowning at sea compared to, and I don't have any witches in the family that got beheaded. But they've got some interesting things. I've divided the family up into 6 basic family groups, and I'll discuss them more or less in order of how they arrived over here in North America. The first group are the English Puritans who arrived up in Massachusetts, and they settled around Andover, Mass, and around Andover, Mass, there are
Keep going.
there are about 11 ponds, hills, and so on that are named after our ancestors. It's sometimes a little difficult finding out all the total number of families that are involved because women were sometimes mentioned as relics in the documentation. But if they went to magistrates, you often got, at least got the first name. So the family I'm most interested in is the Haggett family that settled around Haggett's Pond. Henry Haggett and his wife came over here, and they soon became notorious for cussing out neighbors' pigs, having fights with the neighbors, wishing that the neighbor house will be hit by lightning and burned to the ground. And sometimes the neighbors cussed out their pigs, and they all ended up in front of the magistrate trying to find out what was the cause of this altercation and why were they saying such things on the Sabbath. Well, eventually the Haggett family got out of being servants, and they bought a farm, as I said, down at Haggett's Pond, and they lived there for a while. The soil was miserable, and they eventually sold that farm, and their descendants became servants. The fellow I'm going to refer to as Bunker Hill Haggett was a servant of somebody and went off to the battle at Bunker Hill and fought valiantly, and he died on the way as they're running from the British, as they're crossing Charleston Neck. At least that's the family myth, that's where he passed away. He left behind him a 3-month-old son, and he disappears from the record until he marries Mehitable Pearl. He married her in the late 1700s, and they moved up to New Hampshire and built themselves a cabin up there. I have a letter from Mehitable written in 1803 to her mother. She says that she's alone in the cabin. They've got 60 bushels of rye and corn and some meat put aside. Her husband has gone to the shipyards over in Wiscasset on the shore of Maine, and if he lives, he'll return in the spring. She's in this cabin with 2 toddlers and is pregnant. So if you ladies think you got life tough, that's what she had in those days. This fellow, William Haggett, he eventually gave up farming in New Hampshire, and with another family, the Dollar family, moved out to Ohio during the War of 1812. They arrived out in Ohio in December and had to build a cabin and so on. They didn't have any land, so they rented land, and the price of the rent was clearing the land. So life was a little tough for them. And but nevertheless, one of his sons became a doctor, the other son became a druggist. These fellows were very patriotic, and during the Civil War, the druggist lied about his age. He was over age and became a hospital steward, and his older brother, the doctor, became a physician who set up the Army hospital at the Battle of Shiloh. He never saw the battle because he got dysentery and had to leave. The druggist was a little decrepit, put it politely, and eventually the Army realized that he wasn't really a great asset to the Civil War, and they sent him home. Now the next family that came were a bunch of English Quakers who landed down in Maryland, and they eventually they all got kicked out of the Quaker faith because they did non-Quaker things like letting their children marry non-Quakers and things of that sort. But they weren't terribly interesting, as they didn't end up in magistrates' courts and so on. Now, the Scotch-Irish. Oh, I didn't mention why I got interested in. That's the first thing I started out, why I was interested in this business. I got 2 letters. The first letter indicated that there was a death, let's call it a death ship, which sailed from Northern Ireland, and the captain, instead of sailing directly to America, sailed back and forth, zigzagged back and forth, to prolong the journey to starve the passengers, and if they died, he inherited everything they had. The second letter was from a Mennonite, which opened up a whole new window of opportunity for genealogy, because I didn't know it had any Swiss ancestors, and there's zillions of these guys, and I made 2 trips to Switzerland looking them up. And the third thing that got me interested was a visit from a lady who looked up Beckhart in the phone book, finally found a Beckhart in the phone book, and then came over and visited me. And she knew all about Dad, all about my great-grandfather, Jonas Beckhart. And so we had a good talk, and she got me interested in some of the things that Jonas did, especially the fact that he wanted to educate his younger kids when he knew he was old and probably dying. So he rented his farm to his oldest son, and the price of the rent was to educate the younger children. Now, these Scotch-Irish guys, thanks to Russ Haley, I was able to get the goods on this captain. He did zigzag back and forth, but the family never got to Philadelphia on the ship. It crashed on the shores of Cape Cod near Chatham, and the people staggered ashore from there, and some of them went on to other places. The Clintons, who were on board the ship, went on to New York. The Houstons went on to Philadelphia or Pennsylvania. They got land there eventually. The McLean, who in our family history or family mythology took over the ship at Swords Point from the captain, turns up in Pennsylvania. How he got there, I really don't know. His son, Nao, Cornelius McLean, was a rabble-rouser and shows up in the history books as participating in the most fabulous, disgusting, revolting bar fight that ever took place in western Pennsylvania. He married into the Gordons, and that's how the Gordons became notorious. Where the Gordons came from, I don't know. They just appear out of the mists of history. The first thing we have is that a Gordon lady is running across ice floes in some river out in western Pennsylvania during the French and Indian Wars, carrying her baby with her. And she managed to save him, and he eventually became Corporal Gordon in the American Revolution. Corporal Gordon allegedly fought under Lafayette, and allegedly later on in Ohio entertained Lafayette on his trip back to America in the 1820s. The Gordons and the Haggets teamed up together. They met in Ohio, married in Ohio, and that's how they got together. And I think 10 minutes is up, so I've got to shut up.
Keep going.
And so they gradually moved on. The Gambles. There was another interesting guy. It was his, he moved to Ohio, was an architect, built the first town hall in Sydney, Ohio, and once a year would build a flatboat and take a cargo down the Mississippi and sell it in New Orleans. I went through 50 years of records of the New Orleans port and could not find something that explicitly defined him as what the flatboat and what the cargo was. But one year he got caught in the ice and he got there late and he couldn't really sell it in New Orleans. So he hired a schooner and sailed over to Haiti, sold the cargo in Haiti. He bought a billiard ball there, which I possess, and then he took a boat back to Baltimore. There he bought a horse and carriage and rode in style back to Sydney, Ohio. A few years later, he organized a gold mining trip for the 49ers, and he and his sons and sons-in-law and so on all traipsed west. They got out to St. Joe, Mississippi, Joe, Missouri, and they had to wait there for the grass to come up so that there'd be fuel on the plains for the oxen and horses to eat so they could pull the wagons. And he got dysentery, so the family went on, buried him and went on without him. And some of them stayed there a couple of years. One of them got enough gold to build a wedding ring for his fiancée. Some others just managed to make it back home. And so that was the gold rush, which was a big scam as far as they were concerned. The Haggetts kind of passed away. Benjamin Haggett, the druggist, he passed away. His wife, who was a gambler, and quite a poetry writer, and a lady who contributed to the local newspaper, she passed away early of TB. He passed away later, and the older kids were orphans, including my grandmother. She was brought up by relatives and eventually went through normal school, became a school teacher, and went out to the promised land of Denver, where the Beckharts had gone to. And they met there and married in Denver. My father came back to New York to go to college and met my mother at Columbia University, and they got married, and that brought the Myerses and the Beckharts together as one family. Amen.
That was great.